Michael.
Hi,
How are
Alicia.
you?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Welcome to What If I Say Yes? So as we begin all our interviews, I'm gonna ask you to tell the audience, who are you?
So my name is Michael Weinman. I am originally from New York City. That feels important to share for some reason. I have a doctorate in philosophy and have been teaching for a little bit over 20 years now, and often teaching far outside the disciplinary boundaries of philosophy. So maybe important to say, also related to some of the story maybe that we'll get into, that though I was trained in philosophy, I work as a university teacher in many different disciplinary and non-disciplinary contexts. And that's become really formative to who I am professionally, but then also personally.
Okay, so now tell the audience how we know each other.
Yeah, so we know each other perhaps not so very well. It was suggested to me that we would have this conversation by a very dear old friend named Carlos, who is your partner, wife mate, as I understand. And of course, I was thrilled to see a message from him. And then I do feel that I know you a little bit because I took his invitation to see some of the other conversations that you've recorded in this series. And so perhaps there's a way in which I've gotten to know you a little bit that way. But it's a pleasure to get to meet you face to face, even if only virtually now.
Yep, so 23 years ago this summer, we were joining the new school. And so, yes, I heard of you via Carlos. I knew that you were in philosophy. I knew that you were a dear friend. I asked him today, this morning, if he had taken any classes with you, and he said he remembers one.
Mm-hmm.
And that he was with these big shots, you and Rodrigo and another woman he remembers from Mexico. So all these people who knew a lot of things about this class, and there he was just joining. And but anyway, he continued his friendship with you. I know he has you in a very high esteem. So yes, when he started sending invitations and you said yes, I said, well, this is my opportunity to get to know him now.
I'm so
welcome.
glad.
And thank you for having said yes to coming here. Okay, so tell us about a moment in your life when you asked the question, what if I say yes? You said yes, and then you did something.
Yes. So almost exactly 15 years ago, and because I knew we'd be having this conversation, I tried to see if I could really pin down the particular day where I said yes. And I can't, right? So it's like one of these funny times where clearly there was one moment where the decision was truly made, but I can't quite figure out, at least from like the email record, nor by speaking with my partner, which day exactly it was. But between January and April of 2008, we decided to move our small family from Washington, D.C. To Israel, at least for a while, meaning we had an opportunity for Reed, my partner, to take a postdoctoral fellowship in Jerusalem. And so the big question is, right, it came to me to say yes, and is that right, we had a small son, so it now meant for us, not for her, but for us, to leave the United States, at least for a time, and for her to accept that offer and for me to leave, at least for a time, the position that I had at St. John's College teaching in Annapolis, Maryland. So that's the time that comes to mind where I said yes. It was very epochal. It changed our lives in many ways, and it's a sort of round number. So it happens to be basically exactly 15 years ago. So that's the moment that I thought of, that I knew at the time, or felt at the time, that it was a pretty big decision, but it's turned out to be even more eventful than I might have imagined, although I'm speaking to you today from Bloomington, Indiana, which is not Israel. So obviously it's not that we moved there and nothing else changed, but it set off a series of unpredictable changes in our lives as a family that that probably wouldn't have happened had we stayed in Washington, D.C., and had I stayed in that position. There would have been a stability in our lives that would be, you could compare it to our lives as they are. But there would have been a lot of other things, which maybe we could talk about, that never would have happened had we not, made that first move in 2008.
How long had you been teaching at St. John's?
So it was relatively, maybe that made it somewhat easier because it was relatively new. So it's not like I had been there forever by any means, but I had graduated from the new school in 2005. And this was like the first job after, so I'd only been there 3 years, but, but there was a kind of mutual understanding that was, it was also the job I had always wanted. In many ways, it had been a dream job, and when I graduated with my PhD, it's not as though I had interviewed at 9 different places and had these offers and, was building this career and waiting for the next job. I had seen, I'd spoken with people that I knew at St. John's, at this college, and seen if it might be possible to work there, and they'd interviewed me. And so it had felt like a kind of forever engagement. A million things can happen as an academic, but it was a kind of unique situation. And it was hard, it was hard to say yes for that reason, because it was a deeply personal, and it was felt personally by my current employer, you could say, and so on and so forth. So it was impactful, and it was connected to Arit's career and our son Ido as a baby, and just imagining what it meant for his future life and his ability to meet all this family that he had over there. So there were a lot of things wrapped into that decision.
Was that a decision that took you hours, days, weeks?
Yeah, that's a great, right. So I was thinking about that. I remember weeks. Surely it took weeks, but not ages either. I mean, in other words, for such a big change, it happened relatively fast. Because whatever the precise details, it wasn't one of these like planned career trajectories that academics maybe have of like in the summer prior, you send out a series of applications and so on and so forth. And you ready yourself, likely you won't get interviewed, likely you won't get anything, but you never know. And, this was something, it was, a kind of opportunistic moment. So it took weeks, but we went from not at all considering this at New Year's to having plane tickets by this time of the year, so meaning within 10 weeks, we went from not even knowing this was a remote possibility to it being what we're doing. And the actual concrete offer and having to know if we're going to take it or not, that was a little over a month, which felt like way not enough time to make this decision. But yeah.
When you moved, did you have a job over there?
No.
And the idea was that you just went as a partner, as a father, and then did you know how long? For how long?
No.
No.
I mean, I could be exaggerating slightly. I mean, in other words, we knew it wouldn't be any less than 10 months.
Okay.
So that makes it a little, but we knew it also might be 2 years or longer. And there was, and maybe in fairness to the non-insanity of the decision, my mother, my mother would not be happy if I didn't point out that I had received a leave from my position. So, I mean, there was always the opportunity to return if that felt like what we should do. But in the end, I did find work. I also didn't speak Hebrew at the time, but I do now because of that decision. And that mattered not just for work. I mean, you can, it's a global society and so on and so forth. So you can live and work in Israel without Hebrew. But what I couldn't do, for instance, was speak with my partner's grandmother, who was still alive. And that was important, so that was sort of the project. The project was to be the supporting spouse, and to be with Ido, our infant son, and to learn Hebrew. That was the main, what am I doing in the time there? And as we made the decision, was those things. And financially, we would manage. That was sort of the idea. And the postdoctoral fellowship did not pay a lot, but it was doable. And then in the end, I did get work there. And then in the end, we stayed 2 years.
How long after arriving did you get a job?
So we decided in April, we arrived in June, and I did not have employment until October. And that's another thing where employment in this case means a teaching gig. And then there ended up being 3 of them, not 1, but all of them came quite literally the week before the semester began. And there the semester begins significantly later than in the US. So in other words, even in September, I neither had employment nor knew that I would have employment. And then sort of all of a sudden in October, I ended up, because we were sort of asking everywhere, I ended up having, 3 appointments. And then one of them, I don't want to spill the beans, but one of them then turned into a potentially full-time position that I ended up not taking. But that's another story.
So if you could name the first things that come to mind about the things you learn or you gain after having said this yes, or because you've said yes to this opportunity, what would you say?
I mean, the first one that jumps right out of my heart, and so it's obviously very raw and real still, is that I anticipated that I would be able to devote more time to being a parent by saying yes in this very specific context. I mean, my employer, I want to say for the record, St. John's College, was amazing, and sort of giving me informal, and if I had asked, formal parental leave. And that's essentially what this was, right? This was essentially, it wasn't legally codified that way, but it was essentially an unpaid, mind you, parental leave. But also before I physically departed from the US, our son had been born in Thanksgiving week, the Tuesday of. So, and they had more or less kind of given me the rest of the semester off, and they really accommodated the spring schedule. So within the realm of American employers, I'd been able to be a very active parent all through that fall, late fall and winter and spring. But definitely the thing that was most motivating me to say the yes to this opportunity was that I knew that if we made this big transformative change in our lives, I would definitely be I would be much more present with Ido, with our son. And I really craved that and wanted that.
Mhm.
And I also knew that, that it was a great professional opportunity for Reed, who didn't have something as compelling in the United States, which also meant that, her way of being the parent would also change. And I don't know if this is going to sound selfish, but like I welcomed the idea that in our family, right, like she'd have the more active academic engagement and title for this particular period where our son was so small, right, before preschool, and at least in my circles, this was still a rare thing, right, that the dad would be staying at home with the 9, 10, 11-month-old, 15-month-old, that kind of thing. And I loved that about this structure. Yeah. And there are other things, but that was the really big one.
But no, do you have any more? So that's the first that jumped to your mind, and then.
Yeah, and then I would have a relationship with my essentially, my sort of, well, let's put it this way, with my son's great grandmother, and she's Wilisa was her name, Wilisi. And I mean, she was just, she lived a great many years. She died, less than 5 years ago, at 93.
Wow.
And so I got to know her. I was blessed to know her for, just about 15 years. And in this period, and I couldn't have known, so I'm trying to remember what I was really deciding and what I learned after. I couldn't have known, still living in Washington, D.C. in April, how close I would become to Rosie. But I had guesses, because for a little while, we even lived in the same house, because she was living in her son's house, essentially, in my partner's parents' house. So she was living there with them at the time, and we lived there with them for about 6 weeks until we had our own place. So I knew that would be true. And I knew that I intended to learn Hebrew, which I needed to know which needed to happen for me to really relate to her, because she spoke 7 languages, right, including French, which was our shared language at the time. But my French is, my French is nothing to speak of. So, yes, so I knew, so she did not speak English, or only barely, right? That was maybe her 8th language after, Ladino and Bulgarian and Hebrew, obviously, and French and Spanish. Spanish
Really?
is basically, well, Ladino is, right? So she spoke Spanish quite fluently, actually, because of the Ladino, which was as fluent for her as Bulgarian. Before she emigrated, and then in Israel, she learned Hebrew. So then she had like 4 mother tongues, but she also knew German and French from school. And she also knew Russian because of anyway. So then English is the 8th language. So those are the 2 big ones. And so they're about specific people. My son, in one case, was really an infant then. And Rosie, who was sort of, someone I sort of vaguely knew. And I thought, this would really, this year or however long it ended up being, would really change the way that the presence that she plays in my life, and my grandparents had all died when I was younger. And so anyway, so that was a real craving and a real addition.
To understand how important it was for you to have a closer relationship with her. I mean, she sounds like an amazing woman. But in the context of the family, why was she so important?
Well, okay, right, great. And it's good to, so I had already, there's like family lore, as there is with all things. So some of it is just, so first of all, I just very, very strongly relate to her because of assonances, you might say, or whatever, similarities in her life story to my mother's life story. So she's almost, and there are tons of differences in the sense that my mother's mother was born in the United States in 1911, whereas Rosie was born in Bulgaria in 1925. So there's almost a generation of difference, plus obviously that huge difference of coming from an Ashkenazi Jewish family that had already migrated to the United States in the very early 20th century to being from a Sephardi or Mizrahi Jewish family in Southeastern Europe who survived the war there in Bulgaria. So tons of differences, but if you kind of push away the differences in the languages they spoke and everything, their life stories were very similar in that they were both very, very, very capable, deeply intelligent, strong-willed women who did not receive a formal education or partially received a formal education that was cut short in Rosie's case because of the war, in my grandmother's case by choice, right? It's like, she was simply not allowed, not her choice, but, the choice of her family. So I related the two of them. Okay, and the other thing, which I didn't even say yet, is that they were both Rosa.
Really?
So my mother's mother was also Rosa.
Wow.
So Rhoda, Rosa, inside the family, they called her Rose, okay, not Rosa, because Rosa, but, Rose. But she was Rose, my grandmother was Rose in the family. So she's Rose and she's Rosa. I didn't even mention that. But so I really had related the two of them. Their educations had been stopped. Despite that, they'd continued their education on their own, avid readers, different languages. My mother's mother also had that, different languages, but read in Yiddish, read in German, read in Russian, always worked, even though women aren't supposed to work, so I'd always really related. So yeah, and my grandmother, who was incredibly dear to me, passed when I was 10. So very, very, very strong influence in my life, and I have very strong memories of her until today. But we kind of missed everything, right? She wasn't there. All the rites of passage, right? She didn't live until my bar mitzvah, high school graduate, none of that. Whereas Reed's grandmother, my partner's grandmother, was super active in her life. And if I can add, one last thing, big one to me is that my grandmother and grandfather, my mother's father as well, but they're, in other words, they're what they bequeathed to what I received from them is essentially my college education, right? So that even though it was many years later, that was their bequest was was to pay for my college education, which is Ruth's grandmother also paid when she came to the new school. So there's all these, so that it's that.
Wow.
Yeah.
When you learned Hebrew, did you learn it from her or did you go to school?
It's sort of both, right? That's so that those things wind together too, because they do this thing, in Israel, the state pays for you to go to an intensive Hebrew class 5 days a week, 6 hours a day, if you wish, as a new migrant, as I was considered. So I did that, and that's where I learned Hebrew. And I learned Hebrew, people are shocked when I tell them, basically, I knew some Hebrew and stuff like that, but basically I learned my Hebrew in 2 months. And I speak, so 6 hours a day, 5 days a week. And I had a basis. So, and I started I started ahead of where I really was, so to say. When I did my interview with them, they're like, where should we place you? And so we were I was like, put me ahead, make it hard on me. So they put me in the sort of intermediate class, and that definitely, so it was hard for a week or two, but then I was, so I was there, but I was also spending an awful lot of time, Reed's family. And it's hard, honestly. I mean, obviously the grammar, I mean, a kind of the rigorous, semi-rigorous understanding of the Hebrew language I have came from the class. But the actually speaking Hebrew definitely came from being so much at home, and specifically with Rosie, who was retired. What did she have to do, right? Like, I'm there with the baby. She's hanging around, retired, you know, and yeah.
So did you learn how to write it?
Yes, yeah. And she helped me with my Hebrew exercises.
Really?
Yeah, okay. She would check my, I would have to write a paragraph and she would check it with her red pen. Yeah.
What did she do? What work? What kind of work did she do?
It's like, I mean, I'm telling you, the story of Rosie is it's a great story. She rose to be the postmistress of the biggest single post office in Israel, which is in Ramat Gan. So, like, you know, the suburb just east of, so it's because it only had one. And she started, I mean, it's a true, you know, it's a true striver immigrant, I think, kind of story, similar to my grandmother, who never had a profession, but, you know, so my mother's mother always kind of worked off it. So Rosie got a job when her husband died, when my partner's dad was only 10. So that, you know, and she herself was in her 30s. So then she got a job instead of just doing things on the side and so on and so forth. And that job was, you know, working as the night cleaner at the post office at that branch. And she went from being, you know, it's that kind of a story. She went from being the night cleaner in the very end of the 1950s. Over the course of the 1960s, they figured out, you know, that she's incredibly good with numbers. I mean, and this is why it's like family lore, like, how did this happen? But, you know, somehow or other, she then became a clerk, and then from being a clerk, she was the head of the clerks, and then she ended up being the director of the whole branch. And I met her in that capacity. So, like, when I first visited Israel, she was still working. She was, you know, she was approaching her 70th birthday. Wow. And, she was approaching, she was approaching mandatory retirement age. That's what the point is. And so she was still working. She was no longer the director, but she was still working at the post office. That was not the very first time I met her, but one of the first times that I met her was on the job at the post office, which I'm getting visual memories of anyway, which is right on the central square in Ramat Gan, in this small town just outside Tel Aviv. So, and then that's what she did. So she directed the place, and eventually, you know, she got her son a job there, and then he became, you know, like a high-ranking whatever official in the main office of the post office in Tel Aviv. But essentially through her, you know, through her connections. Amazing person. Yeah. So that was that. So the son was the big thing. The partner's grandmother was a second major consideration, and the Hebrew language connected with her was, you know, was like a third.
Your kid was too little to remember anything. Does he have any memories of that time living there, of her, or of life over there? Nothing.
He does. Oh, well, he does have memories of what he doesn't remember, of course, right? What he doesn't remember is living in Washington, D.C., because that was way, you know, because that was way, you know, he was tiny. He tells everyone he's from there, and we've gone back. We've had, you know, so not so many times, but we've had reasons to be back in Washington, D.C. as a family. And he wants to see the hospital that he was born in. And he's seen the house where he lived as a baby. He was curious about that. But of that, there's surely no memory. But he does remember, he absolutely, I mean, it's sort of, there are aides to remembering because Arid's parents have lived in the same house. So they were living in that house, and his great-grandmother was living there with them. And that's still the house they live in. So when we go back to visit now, he's going to the same house. And if we, and if we share pictures of that time that he lived there, it ended up being 2 years and a bit. So when we share pictures of that time, by the end of that period, he was almost 3. And he definitely, or at least, right, so he reports having memories of that time. But of course, then it all sort of bleeds together. And this is part of what I was saying yes to that I had no way of knowing, which is that at the end of that time in Israel, we did not return to the United States, but ended up moving for some reasons to Berlin. And that meant that we were kind of back and forth between Berlin and Israel a number of times every year because it's much easier and much less expensive from there. And so
why did you go to Berlin?
Well, the reason.
Well, if you can share it, if not, we'll just
no,
give it to another.
Well, I wanted to say, like, this was an even crazier decision. I mean, in other words,
oh my goodness.
So to Berlin, so the very concrete reason why we went to Berlin, which was not a decision to move to Berlin by any means, and let me explain, was that Irit had received, my partner had received a grant to do a follow-up research. So, okay, we're now, if we're thinking about that moment, like the end of the 2-year residence in Israel, we're talking about the summer of 2010. And in between what's happened is he'd received not a fellowship, not a position exactly, but a grant, a stipend to return to Berlin to update her dissertation research, which by then was, almost 5 years old, and then convert the dissertation itself, which she had defended in 2008, into a book. So here we are, summer of 2010, thinking we're on our way back to the United States after this Israeli sojourn. And then I asked for a little more time, as I never gave up that job back in the US, and asked for a little more time to go to Berlin together with Reed. I don't have a job there either. Same sort of story, but even kind of crazier because it's not like a full year and it's not, right. And then one thing led to another, and eventually we stayed in Berlin for 10 years.
Oh my goodness.
But that's not like when I said yes, because I never really said yes. I mean, there was no saying yes to one thing in particular. But that's what I mean, that one saying yes to what felt like something like a parental leave, honestly, to me at the time, way back in the winter of 2008, that turned out to be, right, like this journey of, now 15 years where we lived for those 2 years in Israel. We then ended up with 10 years living in Berlin. Right now, I'm speaking to you from Bloomington, Indiana, which is where we live.
At what point did you have to go back to St. John's and say, well, remember it was going to be just a little bit?
Right. Yeah. So in a way, this could get us toward the saying no moment, because what ended up happening was that no, I'm only laughing because I guess I was sitting let's put it this way. I was sitting in a living room in Annapolis, Maryland, which is where St. John's College is. So what had been going on through these years is that from time to time, I mean, that's I would do something at the college and for the college, both out of interest and desire, and as a way of keeping the relationship, because we thought I would be returning full time, and they were willing to wait. They were amazingly patient and generous. So I was sitting in one of these occasions. I was teaching a summer course at the college, and it really became time to decide not really if I was returning to St. John's College in Annapolis full time, but if I would take a position in Israel, a permanent position. And
the one you said you didn't take?
That's why I say this could be the segue to the no. I don't know if we want to go there yet, or we could leave that for later. But basically, and this doesn't necessarily intrinsically make sense either, but by not taking the position in Israel, we ended up living for 10 years in Berlin and not in Annapolis. But that's sort of how it happened.
How did you present the idea to them? Like, how was negotiation with St. John saying, well, remember it was going to be just a little while, but then we're not coming back. We're actually going to Germany. And then thank you so much for having waited. Like, how did you approach that conversation with them?
Well, I think that I think by telling the truth, honestly, which they were ready to believe, and which maybe not maybe not in every academic institution can you really tell the truth this way, because it wouldn't seem relevant, honestly. And but in other words, the truth is we were doing everything we could do. My daughter was not yet born, but was coming into the world, but was on her way, I guess. But right. I mean, essentially that way. If I say, we're doing everything we can to keep, by that moment, potentially the four of us kind of together in the way that is the most rewarding for everyone. So that's the way that I eventually, that's the way that I eventually sort of had to communicate that with friends, really. I mean, so obviously, like, bosses or whatever, but in that particular circumstance, with people who were friends, who'd made, who'd welcomed me there and had made really great efforts to kind of keep me there. I mean, as a part of the faculty, even when I was physically away, almost as long as I'd been there physically. When you do the math, the story of St. John's and me, it's like a story of about 6-ish years where I was away more than I was there. But I think, right, that was the way. Maybe I don't have another way of being or something like that, but also I felt in that context, that's right, that was the way that was. It wasn't about this position or that position or negotiating, salaries and status or different things. It was just, an honest accounting of how I can be the person in my family that I feel that I need to be. And that in the end, that unfortunately meant not being there.
So now, before going to the no, that we already know what it's going to be, I'm very curious about two things. First, how has this whole experience enriched or changed your teaching now in the United States, having had these wonderful experiences abroad? And are you teaching your kids Hebrew?
Second one first, maybe it's easy. But okay. So they yes. Rona, I mean, so I would say there's a difference between the two of them, which I think has to do with their life experiences. Rona was born in Berlin, lived mostly there, then moved here, went to school, went to kindergarten in Berlin in Hebrew and in German, no English. But then English is so dominant that English has become dominant for her, for different reasons. But definitely, it's not about us so much teaching her Hebrew. which she's now learning as in America as a quasi-American because her bat mitzvah is coming up, so she's that age. So whereas he does Hebrew, like I'd be tempted to say that he does Hebrew is better than mine, and his German is definitely better than mine, and and some of that is that, right? I mean, he had that, he had an infancy and toddlerhood in Israel and really, soaked that up, and then. And Hebrew was very supported in Berlin in the community we were in. So not so much us teaching them Hebrew in that sense, but Hebrew is a big part, and German is a big part of their lives. Also in their friendships, which they maintain, through different, I don't want to say what applications my son uses, but, through different applications on the phone, or sometimes like Zoom, hanging out with friends and things like that. So that for sure, which is a huge influence, certainly in my life. So our children being multilingual in that way has completely changed the life I would have had as an adult. Otherwise, and even having had the partner that the wife made that I had chosen by the point of that, things would have been really different. I never would have learned Hebrew. I probably never would have lived, who knows, but it's highly likely that we never would have lived outside of the US. And so I would have been an American, right, with a partner who's, who's not, or at least has not yet become an American. And and children, who have dual citizenships and maybe speak language, but everything changed in that way. And so so it's not so much that of them learning Hebrew or us making sure that they, or something like that, but that Hebrew and German actually both are a natural part of their lives in a way that would have been completely unpredictable, obviously completely unpredictable in 2008. Teaching, I think like right now I'm teaching a class on religion, politics, and public policy. And I think a lot of that course is going the way that it would have gone had these changes in our life not happened. But the whole last third of the course is a comparison between, secularism or something about, the role of religion in public life in France, Britain, Germany, and the United States. And I might have wished to, probably there would have been such a unit in such a course I would have taught had we never had this journey. But what I'm specifically bringing to the class and asking the students to consider, and the stories that I tell in class from my life experience, are completely different. And we just had this great conversation on Wednesday, for instance, the last time this class met. We had this great conversation about tokenism and how that functions in the United States, and then and they were relating it to what they were reading about the ways in which a commentator in public who happens to be in Germany, who happens to be of Turkish descent, and a woman, how her words are used to justify certain Islamophobic or Eurocentric, right? I mean, and so in the name of, right, well, you could imagine, right? I mean, in the name of demonstrating how far Germany has come as a society. Look, don't take it from, Wolfgang Thierse, or whatever, right? Don't just listen to what Lala says or whatever. And I think that, we would have read of such an example, and I might have had thoughts about it. They might have not been totally stupid, but it's obviously completely different that we were there in Berlin, for this decade where so many of these debates really exploded, that now in class here in the US, discussing with students through academic texts, and I'm able to kind of talk to them about what it was like to be at a certain rally, what it was like to walk down the street and believe it or not, like there in Berlin, I would often be interpolated as Turkish or something, right? In other words, like I didn't read white in Berlin or whatever. If I was walking the street speaking Hebrew, for instance, with one of the kids, we would be figured as Ausländer, right? As
Wow.
foreigners. And so I don't, it's not like I don't, it's not that I seek to represent that in class, but that the fact that I had those experiences profoundly impacts the way that I lead, right, a discussion about these comparisons, I hope, right, in a way that isn't theoretical or abstract, but is really about how does it feel, to walk on a street in Paris or Berlin or London or Haifa, and see these conflicts in these different societies.
Very interesting. Okay, so now let's delve into that moment in your life when you said, no, I'm not taking this permanent decision. Thank you. Why, how, what happened in your mind?
Right. So after all these beautiful and celebratory things, right, about those 2 years in Israel, then the next decision was not to avail ourselves of the possibility of living in Israel permanently. And so that's the no. And I mean, definitely.
Is it a no that you can explain publicly, or is it more like an internal no? And that's it?
No, my hesitation was only that, happy to. And I think there are two, like with all of them, right? I mean, there's, there's what rests behind the thing that you're pushing away. And there's the thing that's behind that which is pulling you back, that's leading you to push away, So in this specific case, what that means is that the concrete decision became to return as a family to Israel. And let's just say at this moment, just I'm reminding myself, at this particular moment, our family of not yet 4, but we're getting there. Or maybe we are, I don't know. I don't want to, those are serious debates, I guess, right? But our family is in Berlin in an apartment that we need to leave in 2 months. We know that that's the situation. So we're in an apartment that we know that we need to leave in 2 months. We could be going back to Washington, D.C., where there's a bunch of stuff that we never moved out of storage. We could be moving back to Israel, where there's a bunch of stuff that we never moved out of storage. And we're living in an apartment that is sublet, right? Where we don't have any stuff, And what we're saying, and that's why I sort of frame it that way, to say, in a sense, it's like a double no, right? It's not so much a concrete yes to something in Berlin. It's a way of saying, right, like, no, we're not going to return to the US. No, we're not going to return to Israel. So the hesitation was simply like, how do you really characterize it? Because obviously it was a decision. In some ways, it was a decision to say yes to, but there wasn't anything we were saying yes to. It was a decision to stay in Berlin. I mean, and not to accept 2 alternatives that were presented, that were clearer. In my professional case, they were much clearer: permanent or potentially permanent job here, permanent or potentially permanent job there. In Berlin, neither of us had a potentially permanent job, but we each could work. And so we weren't really so much saying yes to anything because no one made us an offer to stay in Berlin per se, but we did decide to say no to each of those other possibilities. And what, so, and that's why I think that's what came to mind is like a time I said no, because it really was more about saying no than saying yes at that particular moment. And the saying of no sort of determined a course that then turned into, a professional horizon, for each of us, but not in a clear way. And I guess it was, and that's why it strikes me as a moment where we said no, because like what we were saying no to in a sense was the concreteness of each of those two offers. And as much as different things appealed about them, it just didn't feel like that's where our family should be. Not there and not there at this moment. We should do this here, even if it's, and that, even if your parents aren't from here and my parents aren't from here, and there are ways in which you could feel really alone here, and why do we belong here? And we're a Jewish family. Why Berlin? And you could do a ton of, but yeah, I don't know. Is that a good
What
note?
made you stay? Yes. What made you stay 10 years? I mean, after those very clear no's,
yeah,
and stay in this kind of limbo, in this place where it felt good for you and your family, but you didn't have clear trajectories or clear things to do. What made you stay for 10 years?
Well, and it was right. We didn't, so we stayed. What I would say at the time, this comes back to me. I haven't sort of thought this sentence in a while, but what we would say in those years, what I would find myself saying to friends and family a lot in those years is, we keep trying to leave Berlin and we keep failing. But not to be too blithe about it or whatever. So 3 years after, but these things take time, right, in the academy. But, it's like a bit more than a year after the moment that we're talking about here. The place where I was working contingently, Bard College, Berlin, it's called. It was then called the European College of Liberal Arts. It was called something else then. Anyway, so a bit more than a year, but that's a long time, a bit more than a year after the time we're talking about, they started really talking about a job of the kinds that I said no to in the other places. But it wasn't like we said no to the other things because that was clearly going to happen. Not at all. It was clear that I could sort of keep working there contingently. It wasn't clear that they would offer that. So part of the reason why we ended up staying 10 years is that eventually they made an offer like that. And then eventually that kind of manifested. And then really eventually, meaning, we're talking like 2011, then 2013, then 2016, eventually that ended up being a tenured professorship in certain ZUPD or whatever. So, and so then of course, on one level we stayed because I had that. But of course I'd sort of had that or versions of that in the past too. And so it's not simply that, it's also, you tell a similar story in terms of, reach trajectory that, there was professional meaning, there was meaningful professional engagement. And so we ended up staying. But I think the bottom line is that we realized, sort of in a way, almost despite ourselves, like we realized that we were on the path that we belonged on, and that this other path, which is much easier to tell a parent about, or a grandparent, or whatever, or an aunt, what I mean? It's much easier to explain, oh yeah, so-and-so got a job, we went there. That path just wasn't our path.
And then after 10 years, what made you come back to the United States? I'm so curious now.
Well, okay, so notwithstanding everything I just said, we got offered a job. And no, so I think, yeah, that's basically what it is. It was offered a job here in Indiana, and we decided to move the family to make it possible for her to accept the job. There's more to say about that too. Yeah.
Did it feel like, so you left the United States, you had all these experiences and travels and jobs, coming back here, did it feel like Okay. Or was it like, okay, we're going to the United States and let's see what new adventure we get? Like, was it like coming back home, or was it more like, let's see what happens?
I think it's more like the latter. I mean, also depends. So we began the position in January of 2020. And we moved as a family in June of 2020. And in between, of course, the world stopped, right? So
that's right.
it's, you know, yeah. So it's a hard, but on the level of affect, I think it's definitely the continuing adventure. I mean, because this isn't also because the United States is a big place and there's so much internal differentiation. And I grew up in New York, and then Reet and I, met at university in New York and lived for a time in Washington, D.C. And Indiana is a very different, whatever, right? It's a very different sort of space than either of those spaces. And so, and there, I skipped over, by the way, so in our children's lifetime, we also had a 9-month or 10-month, sort of adventure in Charlottesville, Virginia. Right, in the middle of all that. So, so all four of us have different experiences of the US, but none of us of quite what we're experiencing in Indiana. And so it certainly doesn't feel like a homecoming for me, or I think for any of us. And I also think we try to think of it. I mean, I certainly would understand why people, I meet people and they say, what is it like to come back to the US, right? Meet people here, or talk to family members in New York or Michigan or wherever. I don't feel like I'm coming back to anywhere by moving here. I feel like I'm coming to another new place, and like in all these other moves, right, it requires adjustment or necessitates different kinds of spiritual adjustments. And so we'll see what happens next. None of this, I can guarantee, none of this would ever have happened if I hadn't said yes in April of 2008. Whatever else would have happened, this, mess.
Oh, wow. I wouldn't call it mess. It's
quite
a life adventure. It's like
right. This kaleidoscopic.
What a life! Very interesting. Before we finish this interview, I'm very curious to know what happened when you left Israel. How did you say goodbye to your partner's grandma?
Yeah. Well, this is why I say, we really only said goodbye. We never say, she was disappointed. I'm not going to lie. She was disappointed and she was angry at me. Because she knew that I had the job offer. And this would be we'd be here another hour, but it's like, because it's all very complex, because for Reed, of course, it was sort of going home, right, to go back to Israel, and it was not easy, right, and she was not someone who had intended or really wished to live in Israel as an adult, certainly not by the time she'd gotten deep into her graduate studies in New York. So that prospect did not fill her with unabated joy, let's say. And so that's all in there too. But what made it easier is that up until our departure from Berlin, I would say in a very serious way, we hadn't really left Israel, because all through the time that we were living in Berlin, we really spent, in the time that we lived in Israel, we spent 10 months basically, or almost 10 months of the year in Israel, and then time in the US to keep the job thing going, in those 10 years that we didn't live in Israel, we certainly weren't in Israel 10 months of the year, but, never did 2 months pass that we weren't there for a little time, basically. So, certainly in retrospect, right? That's what that really made possible in a way. That first decision in 2008 made possible this life where unpredictable, sort of unbelievable, very blessed, I think, life, where we more or less lived in Berlin and then had the freedom to spend, sort of count the days, but, spend about 3 months of the year altogether.
Mm.
Two at least for sure, 2 to 3 months of the year at different intervals in Israel.
Mhm.
And so that meant a proximity to family that we wouldn't have had, and so on and so forth. Even if we'd been in the US where my family is, we wouldn't have had that kind of proximity, that real quality time, extended quality time with cousins, and not just, right, so we spoke about the great grandmother, but cousins, aunts, I mean, all that you might imagine, bigger families. So that's, and then the time that we really left was coming here, but it was also the pandemic. So, so
and
no
she
one
had
saw
passed already?
And she had passed. So for her in particular, we hadn't, that knife twist didn't come in her lifetime, thankfully. We were, yeah, I mean, we were in Berlin another full year after she passed.
Have you written about all these? No, are you planning on doing that?
I've had it's been a this is, you think it might be, I mean, I even have I have a title, and
really?
I pitched it once to a trade press, and they were vaguely interested, but it's like, yeah, but
well,
it's
vaguely
like that.
interested is a start.
Yeah, exactly. So
it would be a great book. I mean, it's a wonderful story, a family. It's I mean, I can just see how many things you can include in that book, and it would be so lovely to read.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I hope. I mean, it's very heartening to hear you say that, because for a while this was the thing I most wanted to do in the world, and then I let go of it because the world didn't seem to want it, or whatever. But maybe.
Oh no!
It's been a
Please
pleasure to talk
it.
about it. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Michael, this has been a pleasure. Now,
yes.
Now I may know you even better than Carlos.
Maybe I think so. It's possible. Yeah.
Thank you so much for having shared these wonderful stories. What an amazing life you've had, this period that you've told us about.
Yeah.
Now it's the time when I get to remind you to send pictures, images, whatever you would like to share with the audience, to kind of put now images to the story, to the words that you shared with us. That would be lovely.
Yes.
And well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Carlos said hello, by the way.
Someday in person.
Yes. Thank you so much. I'll wait for your pictures.
Yes.
Bye, Michael.
Bye.